In this video, we're going to take a deeper look into information access and control in eShare. It highlights how teams and those working outside the typical engineering IT sphere, so those working in production, can access information generated by the principal IT systems with a degree of control. This is a more advanced discussion of the software capability, and if you haven't heard of eShare, then it might be worth checking out some of the introductory videos. So we're going to cover the ideas of information access, and with that you need a degree of control over who has access to that information, and in eShare that covers the concept of user roles and user groups. Now once you've defined access to information, maybe you'd like to do a little bit more about it, and that's where some of the more advanced features of eShare comes in, and that considers ideas such as tracking maturity between different teams, so we have one consistent picture of how information is flowing through the system, how maturity is building on different parts. And if anybody has objections, these can be shared between teams or just within a certain team, or controlled by user roles and user groups. So let's first begin by having a look at the concepts around access to information. So let's take a particular scenario. We have a production engineer working on some pipe installation, but something is wrong. Something doesn't seem to match up, and at this point we don't really have an idea of what's going on. So the engineer can look inside all of the manufacturing information that he's been provided to do the job, but still something is missing. Something doesn't really give him an idea of exactly about what is precisely not working. So he decides to call the design engineer. A human-to-human interaction, but obviously we're not always available. We may be on holiday, we may be in a meeting, so that might cause some delay. Well, of course, we know the information is available somewhere. It might be in the engineering systems, and the production engineer could look in those engineering systems, had he the rights, the training to do so. But that's generally not something that an opportunity extended to the production teams within our ship production environments. So what is the potential to happen next? Well, trying to avoid a delay, the production engineer knows, based on previous projects, probably what the problem is. I say probably, he's making an assumption. So, there is a chance of an inconsistency getting in here because the engineer doesn't have the opportunity to find the answer to his query. Now, this is probably a much wider problem. In our shipbuilding environment, in our teams, we often own the software that authors the information that we're interested in. Each team kind of usually gets to select the software to do the tasks they're interested, but it's quite difficult to share that information to other people. And this has typically been the realm of outputs, where we produced hard copies, digital documents, as a way of explaining that information, because that requires just the simple software to view. But that can be challenging because unless you've provided the right information to answer someone else's problem down the workflow, then we may get stuck and they may need to come to you for additional information. Now, the idea of accessing the engineering systems, the original authoring systems, is a nice idea, but in reality, the training, the competency between other groups in the shipyard are not there, and this is really a difficult challenge to overcome. But eShare aims to get over this. It is a single source of truth where we take the information through digital integration into a single server system and organize the documents, give access to the model, and give that system back to everybody. So they can see a consistent view, they can consistently operate the same software to see what information is available to track what is going on. So as I said, this is a single source of truth that primarily integrates existing systems. It doesn't create another data storage system, so it brings that data together. And this is a web-based system, so it's fairly easy to deploy. There's no installation. It can also be viewed on tablet systems. Engineers can view the model, and you can dig into more detail. You can see a picture of the 3D model and understand how things were intended to go together. So in this respect, we can understand the intent. And what that means is that if the manufacturing information doesn't give exactly the information you need to do the task, we can dig into more detail there. As we see here, the production engineer can now see what's going on, even though they don't have access to the original engineering data. But then there becomes the question, should everyone see everything? Well, this is probably not an effective way of running a project. Of course, the engineering teams are coming up with the plans, the ideas, the schedules of how things should work, and they don't necessarily want the production teams using that information before it's ready. So we do need a degree of maturity control to make sure that other groups are only using published, approved, or mature information. This is very much a logical separation of the process. But we also see synergies between members in engineering teams and production teams. So for example, the hull structure team might only want to communicate and share their information. Similarly, for electrical teams and piping teams might only want to communicate between piping and mechanical engineers. So it's logical to have a degree of control about the types of information each group can see. In eShare, this is relatively easily set up. We have the fact today that everyone can see the 3D model, but then with other information systems, we can control just by a simple checkbox system which groups have access to that information. And you can do that for all the different sources of information across the project. So this is a relatively painless way of controlling who sees what inside the project and even outside if you're working with subcontractors and perhaps your customer. So now in eShare, we will take on the role of one of our piping engineers. And we'll take a look in the propulsion room. And when we look at the model information, we just see, in addition to the 3D model, just maturity and work planning information. We'll now change that and allow our piping engineer to access additional information. And it's just a case here of adding the piping engineer to the file adapter and to an Excel adapter that captures ERP data. And as you can see, we're just adding that role to each of these information sources. Finally, we'll add the piping engineer to the PLM data. So now when the piping engineer goes back into the software, they can now see documents, access documents. In the model, they click on the same items. In the propulsion room, we have the propulsion motor. We can see ERP data. If we click on the pipe, we can see PLM data. So now that we have a degree of information control, what more could we do with the capability of the software? Well, first we could look at tracking maturity across the project because we can introduce simple tools to do that. In a traditional sense, most of the IT systems used in a project have simple ways of tracking maturity, but they don't necessarily have a way of doing that together. If that maturity is published, you might have several different indications of maturity. And again, when the engineer who is trying to find out what is going is trying to put that information together to assimilate it, it might have to take a little bit more brain power to figure out where something is. And there's a chance there of making a mistake if something isn't interpreted correctly. Now, since eShare has access to all of the information, it has the ability to provide each groups with a consistent maturity status tracking process. That process may start in engineering. They have the opportunity to instigate the first early stages of it, bring it to a design level of maturity. And during that period, obviously people like the planning process, the production process don't have the opportunity to change that or maybe even see that while that process is going underway. But at a certain point, the information that engineering produce will become mature and they may hand it over onto, for example, the planning team. The planning team will do the things that they do, and during that process, as it matures, they don't want necessarily the engineering team or the production team to take control of that information unless they feel that something is not right, and they may decide to hand it back to engineering. In that respect, the information then becomes less mature. And of course, as you move on, that information may be handed on to production to do the actual fabrication, the manufacturing. And again, they can control the maturity on to the end of the project. In the meantime, engineering and scheduling don't have access to that information directly. They cannot manipulate it unless there is a need to, say, rectify something, and therefore that item becomes immature. By handing each group a simple measure of status that's controlled centrally, accessed centrally, even though it's a very simple piece of information, it means that everybody can see what's going on, and it means that within certain processes, say in engineering, status can be driven by things beyond just engineering, beyond just planning, and beyond just production. Taking a look at this process inside eShare, initially as a piping designer, we've turned on the status management display, the visual style, and we will now select some pipes for moving into the engineering phase of the maturity process. And here we are just selecting a selection of elements that are part of the spool, and the entire spool will be added or assigned and in engineering maturity. If the engineer goes back to try and change the maturity further, they can either change it to in engineering or to a rework state. They cannot move it into an approval state or in production state. If we're now a production person, a production role, and we take a look at the maturity of these items, we can see that they are currently in engineering, but we can only move them into rework. The simplification of the maturity pattern here I'm using means that everybody is sharing the same rework mode. Now let's be a supervisor and approve these pipes for production. Again, we'll select a few pipes here. And now we can see we can move them to approve for production, but I don't like this one. We're going to turn this one back and we can put this into rework. The colors indicate the different states. Now, as the production engineer, we can see which ones are approved. I can focus on them. And if I want to begin production, I can move them into that state. Again, if there was something that I didn't like, I can move an item into rework. This will take things back to the hull engineer. We'll see, actually, I now have some rework available. I will move these into engineering and make the corrections that I've been asked to. Now, when we connect on these, we can additionally see not only the states, but we can also see all the previous history, who made them, when that happened. All of this information is captured inside the software and actually may be used for data mining. Some elements may have large changes, some may be much smaller, depending on the complexity of the situation involved. This configuration of status is set up fairly simply. It needs a few items, a name. It needs an attribute to which we will attach the status. This gives an identifying kind of piece of information. And once we've created some heading information, we will add the different states, and it's just simply a list. And this is my very simple example of representing status, really just 3 states with an extra 2 for rework and completion. And we move these around into some kind of implied logical order, although it doesn't really matter. Next, we will add the different permissions involved. We will allow everybody to see status, but only 3 groups, the structural engineers, the project managers, and production people, can change the states. So our hull engineers, everybody can change a state, but only our structural engineers can put it in engineering. Our project managers can only change it to in engineering and approve for production, and our production team can only put it into production and completed. Everybody could send it to rework, And indeed, we could make a rework stage for each discipline. Next, we set the transitions, so say from undefined into engineering, then to approved for production. This sets the logical transitions that people are allowed to make. Everyone can put it into rework, and rework can only go to engineering. Completed items can also become a rework state. Configuration is as simple as that. Finally, we'll have a look at handling immaturity. And this is the case where something is not right. I need to ask a question, or I don't like something. In eShare, we typically call this markups, but it could be called commenting. And we can see the idea that is across the project, people are receiving information, reviewing information, and they might see that there's something that they don't like. They raise an objection. Now, there are many systems that have the ability to capture these objections, start a formal change management process. Well, this really isn't necessarily the intent of eShare, but what we have is a lot of contextual information in the 3D model, on drawings, on plans, and this is useful so that when somebody reviews the objection, they get an initial context of what's going on. So by capturing an objection with where the objection takes place, with photographs, with clouds and redlining on drawings, we can get more value from just the comment alone. And putting roles aside for a second, all of this is kind of reported, and you see a list of objections that people make as they make them, and you can then click on that comment, that markup, and see within the 3D model what they will be referring to. Same on a drawing. Same idea. Now, having previously talked about managing maturity, from these objections, you may then go on to introduce or go down the formal change management process, allocating tasks to people, not necessarily in eShare, but the integrations with other systems may allow you to do that. And obviously then you're on to controlling the maturity of different processes. Of course, this can all be associated with a formal issue tracking system so that you can get back to having the robust controls that you desire from those kind of systems. And that's something that these systems specialize in, not the intention of eShare. So now let's bring in the idea of how roles affect these things. Well, because we have different user groups and markups, objections can be associated with particular user groups, supervisors, for example, might only see the relevant objections, comments associated with them. So say, for example, engineer would only see comments that the engineering team and anything production wants to feed back to them, whereas the production team might only see issues that are associated with production and they don't want to worry engineering about them. Now, what eShare does is takes this a step forward. So, for example, you may capture the context on a drawing of several objections. It is the same drawing, but obviously engineering, for example, only want to see what's relevant to them, and production only want to see items relevant for them. Because markups are stored independently of the documents, then if the respective people click on that document to see the objections, the markups, then they will see different views of what they're looking at. So next we're going to have a look at some markup objections with roles associated. Creating a document markup is fairly straightforward. We need a name. We allow it to be assigned to people. We can add additional attributes. And then we start to assign what different roles can do with the attributes themselves. So we will allow our piping engineers to create and modify markup. Project managers can do everything, and whole production can only see markup. Our piping engineer will now create a markup. In the document, you see a button to the left, to the right. They can just create some different kind of redlining, text, lines, and this is stored as an overlay with the document. In addition, we can give some title information, assign the action to someone, and give a more detailed comment. And we can see the markup listed on the right hand side with all the detail. Our piping engineer cannot delete, they can only edit. And they can add some more details as they see fit to this markup. Now we gave our welders, our whole production people, the opportunity to see the markup, and we can see the cloud, the red cloud, we can see the comments in the document, but they don't have the ability to do anything with it. It's just viewing. Let's change their role. Let's remove the whole people, whole production from being able to see the markup. We simply save, and now when we go back into the document, all markup is missing. Now we are the role of a supervisor, and we can see the markup. I don't want it, I'm going to delete it, and it's gone. Only supervisors can be given this role. So to summarize what we've covered in the video, we've talked about access to information and also considered who should have access and demonstrated with eShare the impact of user roles and user groups. And we've taken that concept a little bit longer we've taken that concept further by capturing maturity and how that's influenced between the teams, being able to control who can update maturity at a particular time in the process, and then looking at handling immaturity by raising comments or markups, objections that can be looked at either across the project or within teams and managed within the teams themselves. Thank you very much for reviewing this video.